The Industrial Revolution was a time of prosperity in America. Historians agree that this period, also called the Gilded Age, started somewhere around 1820 and went through the turn of the 20th century. Men such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller built industrial empires employing thousands of workers. Steel, oil, and railroads drove the rapid advances of modern American society. At its core, the Industrial Revolution blended innovative technology with a growing labor force. Being part of the middle class in the mid 1800s didn't mean earning an average wage, as much as it was about being educated and in a profession such as a lawyer, a teacher, or a banker. While these professions were in different financial brackets, i.e., the lawyer wouldn't make as much as the teacher, they were still both considered to be middle class. Despite the growing distribution of wealth at this time, in 1890, 11 million of America's 12 million people still earned less than $1,200 a year. And of those families, the average income was well below the poverty line at $380. One of the first men to make an impact on the Industrial Revolution, and thus the growing middle class, was an Englishman named Samuel Slater. When his father died, Slater's family sent him to apprentice with Jedediah Strutt, who owned several cotton mills in the UK. Slater worked with Strutt until he was 21 and then memorized all he could about the machines and practices without writing much down before he boarded a ship to the States. Once in the U.S., he teamed up with Moses Brown in Pawtucket, Rhode Island to create and open the first successful water-powered textile mills in the U.S. In 1793, Slater's wife, Hannah Wilkinson, invented a type of cotton sewing thread and in the same year became the first American woman to be given a patent. At first, Slater employed women and children in his mill, eventually bringing in whole families and building mill towns. Slater is often called the father of the American Industrial Revolution for taking the knowledge and skills of the English Revolution and bringing them overseas, an action which also earned him the title Slater the Trader in England. Before people actually started to go to work, manufacturers would sell pieces to individuals to be put in their homes and then sent back for sale. The most common items being pieces of cloth women would make into clothes or shoes. When company owners had the idea to bring the people working in their homes into one building, the factory was invented. The introduction of factories allowed employers to hire people other than skilled craftsmen. The division of labor allowed unskilled workers to operate simple machinery and move things around the plant. Factories produced more with less manpower and as well as putting production on a larger scale. These changes to how people worked also affected how they were paid. A farmer's workload depended on the time of year, while a factory worker's depended on the clock. Also, craftsmen who worked for themselves before moving to factories would work for their price or how much they produced. The Industrial Revolution was, for the most part, made up by a few key industries such as steel, railroads, textiles, kerosene, and later electricity. It was these industries that over the period of about 100 years built America up from the ground into a new modern age. One reason factories were so successful during this period was because labor was very cheap. Some skilled craftsmen, mostly immigrants from places like Great Britain or Germany, were able to continue in their trades, but many couldn't compete. The introduction of the steamboat in the early 1800s allowed goods to be shipped all over the country via recently built canals, thus lowering shipping time and prices dramatically. By the 1860s, there were more than 30,000 miles of canals in the U.S. In addition, when the telegraph was released, it allowed merchants to know when they could expect their shipments and how much they could expect to sell them for. Most business in any industry still had to adhere to the demands of the factory and company owners to get their materials and products sold. Though, regardless of who you were, the average working day was still a grueling 12 to 16 hours in dangerous conditions ranging from working with molten steel to using fast-moving, sharp equipment. Many steel and coal factories built company towns where rent was cheaper and workers were never far away from the factories where they worked. Some were even paid in company money, which they would then exchange for company food and goods to live on from a company store, creating a loop where a family became totally dependent on the factory and therefore unable to move and make a better life. The working conditions in the early Industrial Revolution were not designed for safety. It was common for multiple deaths to occur during a week from things like mine collapses, explosions, textile fires, or even something as simple as exhaustion. Those fortunate enough not to be forced to live in company towns found luxuries easier to come by. With the amount factories were pumping out, the price of most everyday goods dropped down to what most people could afford. The consumption of goods was the first mark of a growing middle class. Soon a group of people other than the rich were able to afford things such as clothes, tools, and furniture. With these advances, the standard of living for many people grew and the economy received a boost from all the extra spending. Men who started empires such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan watched their industries and monopolies grow at an unprecedented rate. The continuing imbalance of wealth and overall horrible working conditions for the majority of workers led to the formation of labor unions across the country. But it also led to the sometimes violent strikes where the demands of workers were not met. One of the more famous, though sometimes still overlooked by popular education because of its violent nature, was a strike known as the Homestead Strike that started on June 30th, 1892 and ended in a bloody battle on July 6th. Andrew Carnegie, the man who was responsible for creating the world's largest steel empire, had gone back to Scotland where he was born and left his Pittsburgh refinery in charge of one Henry Frick. Frick was known as a ruthless man and soon cut wages due to the cutbacks in budget, while still making workers work 12 hours or more a day. Sensing a strike was coming in the near future, Frick ramped up steel production to prepare. Of course, it wasn't long until workers rebelled. 2,000 men barricaded themselves in front of the mill to prevent anyone from going in or out, and stayed there until Frick fought back by hiring the Pinkerton Police Force, a militia that at the time had more firepower than the entire U.S. Army. The clash resulted in 9 dead and many more injured and unable to return to work. The workers turned to the Pennsylvania state government, but in the end, the government sided with Frick and he returned to management. Another hallmark of the middle class in the 19th century was education. With the expansion of public schools, more people, especially women, were able to become teachers. Now a middle-class family could afford to put their children through high school. Eventually, state-mandated legislature was released stating every child from ages 6 to 12 had to go to school. This created a new wave of people eligible for the new white-collar work world. It also allowed immigrant children to learn alongside others to create a reinforced sense of American nationalism. The middle class during the 19th century was one of the first generations to realize the American dream. Thousands of people rose from rags to riches, making their way along in life with an entrepreneurial spirit that for some never died. It was a time with less regulation and more uncharted territory to explore, more things to be invented and improve upon.